Behind the gates of an upscale suburban neighborhood, appearances meant everything. Lawns manicured to perfection, fences painted the same shade of white, and the HOA board watching every move. But beneath the surface of order and prestige, a storm was brewing. A black homeowner had worked tirelessly to earn his place here, cherishing the quiet and his dream home with its sparkling backyard pool. Yet one neighbor felt entitled to take what wasn't hers. She thought no one would notice her slipping past the fence, dipping into the water and lounging as if it belonged to her. What she didn't know was that every trespass was being recorded, and the day of her public humiliation was already set in motion. In the quiet hum of suburban life, there are rules both spoken and unspoken. The rules were designed, or so the HOA claimed, to keep order, to protect the so-called harmony of the neighborhood. But for Marcus, a black man in his mid-30s who had worked harder than most could imagine to purchase his dream home, the rules always seemed to bend against him. Marcus had grown up with little, raised by a mother who juggled 2 jobs to put food on the table. He had seen firsthand what perseverance looked like. Through nights of study and days of tireless labor, he carved out a career in tech that rewarded his persistence with financial success. The house he eventually purchased, sitting proudly at the end of a cul-de-sac, was not just bricks and mortar, it was a symbol of everything he and his family had fought for. It had a backyard that glowed in the evening sun, where a pool shimmered beneath the sky. That pool was his sanctuary. On weekends, Marcus would sit by the edge with a book or float in the water, letting the stress of deadlines and boardroom battles dissolve. But in neighborhoods like this, there's always someone watching. And in Marcus's neighborhood, that someone was Karen. Karen prided herself on being the unofficial eyes of the community. To some, she was nosy. To others, she was a nuisance. To Marcus, she was trouble. A middle-aged woman who had lived there for years, she carried herself as if the entire neighborhood had been built for her convenience. Her house sat 2 doors down, its yard meticulously trimmed, but her eyes were always cast beyond her property lines. Karen had a history of nitpicking her neighbors, reporting trash cans left out for an extra hour, sending pictures of overgrown lawns to the HOA, even complaining about cars parked slightly crooked in the driveway. For Marcus, she seemed especially alert. The first week he moved in, he received an HOA letter warning about improper garbage disposal. The accusation was vague, but Marcus remembered taking his bins out exactly on time. Later, when he left his car parked on the street for a single night, another letter appeared. He began to notice a pattern. Every time an issue was raised, Karen's gaze would linger just a little longer on his property. At first, Marcus brushed it off. He wasn't about to let someone's pettiness ruin his peace. But what started as irritation soon became intrusion. One warm afternoon, Marcus returned from a run to find his backyard gate unlatched. He shrugged, assuming he'd forgotten to lock it. But then he noticed damp footprints on the concrete near the pool. At first he thought maybe a neighborhood kid had snuck in. Yet the footprints didn't look like those of a child. They were larger, adult-sized. It unsettled him, but he tightened the lock and went about his evening. The next week, while working from home, Marcus glanced out the window and froze. There, lounging by his pool, was Karen. She wore oversized sunglasses, sprawled across his deck chair with a drink in hand, as if she were on vacation at her own resort. Marcus's first reaction was disbelief. Was he seeing this right? Before he could step outside, she rose casually, dipped her toes into the water, and then walked off toward the gate. He couldn't believe it. Karen had trespassed on his property, completely unfazed. Marcus decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. Maybe she was confused, maybe there was some misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew better. Karen knew exactly what she was doing, and it wasn't the last time. Over the next several weeks, Marcus began noticing subtle signs. A towel left behind, the faint scent of perfume on his pool float, wet patches on the deck after he returned from errands. Every time, the evidence pointed to Karen sneaking in while he was away. The insult wasn't just the trespassing, it was the entitlement. Karen acted as though his pool was simply an extension of her lifestyle, as though his ownership meant nothing. Marcus wanted to confront her, but he knew her type. she would deny it, twist the story, and perhaps even report him to the HOA for harassment. The tension gnawed at him. He had worked so hard for this home, yet here was someone undermining it, mocking his presence with her arrogance. Worse still, the HOA had been quick to penalize him for the smallest things, yet Karen could trespass without consequence. Marcus realized he couldn't rely on the HOA for fairness. If he wanted justice, he would have to be patient, strategic, and precise. He installed security cameras. Not obvious ones, small, discreet devices tucked beneath the eaves of his home, another hidden near the pool equipment. He synced them to his phone, ready to capture every movement, and soon the proof arrived. Within days, the cameras recorded Karen entering through his side gate. She carried a tote bag, a book, and even snacks, as if preparing for a day at the pool. She stretched out on his lounge chair, slipped into the water, and floated peacefully for hours. The footage showed it all. Her entering, lounging, and leaving without permission. Marcus clenched his jaw as he watched the playback. It wasn't just trespassing anymore. It was mockery. At that moment, Marcus knew he couldn't let this slide. This wasn't just about a pool. It was about respect, boundaries, and the audacity of entitlement. Karen believed she could do as she pleased, while Marcus would remain silent. She assumed the HOA would be on her side if he ever dared to speak up. But Marcus wasn't going to play by her assumptions. He began planning. Patiently. Quietly. Each time Karen trespassed, he let her dig deeper into her own arrogance. Each video clip became another piece of undeniable evidence. Each careless act of lounging in his pool became another step toward the moment she would be exposed. Marcus knew this wasn't just about catching her. It was about setting the stage so that when the truth finally came out, Karen would regret every smug glance, every arrogant intrusion, and every entitled assumption she had ever made. The stage was set. All he needed to do was wait for the perfect moment to bring it all crashing down. The camera footage was all the confirmation Marcus needed. It played like a bad parody. Karen waltzing through his gate with a sun hat, making herself at home as if his backyard had been built for her personal enjoyment. The more Marcus watched, the more his anger settled into something sharper. Strategy. He wasn't going to storm over and demand she stop. That would play directly into her hands. No. If Karen wanted to keep playing games, Marcus would let her, until the moment her arrogance turned into her undoing. But patience was hard. Each time he came home and saw damp deck chairs, he had to bite down his frustration. Each time his camera pinged while he was away, showing Karen floating smugly in his pool, he forced himself to remain calm. He told no one, not neighbors, not even his colleagues. If this was going to work, he had to keep it quiet. The HOA, however, wasn't quiet. About a week after installing his cameras, Marcus received yet another letter. This one accused him of having unauthorized structures in his yard. Confused, Marcus reread the rules. His backyard contained nothing beyond the pool, standard deck furniture, and a small shed for pool equipment. Still, the HOA insisted he had violated the guidelines. Attached was a blurry photo showing the corner of his yard. It was Karen's doing. He recognized the angle from where her kitchen window overlooked his property. It was the same tactic, the same harassment, only this time with official backing. And the irony burned. Here she was accusing him of violations while she herself was trespassing regularly. Marcus knew she was counting on him to make a scene. Karen's type thrived on creating drama and spinning it in her favor. If he lost his temper, she'd play the victim. So instead, he smiled. Each letter, each baseless accusation, only fueled his resolve. And then, Karen escalated. One sweltering Saturday afternoon, Marcus had been inside on a work call when his phone buzzed with a motion alert from the camera. He opened the feed and nearly choked. Karen wasn't just lounging this time. She had brought 2 friends. 3 women were stretched out across his deck chairs, sipping wine coolers like it was their personal country club. One of them even dipped into his pool with a floaty. Marcus's stomach turned with disbelief. Trespassing was one thing, but inviting guests, that was pure audacity. And worse, she was turning his sanctuary into her spectacle. The footage showed them laughing, clinking glasses, and snapping photos by the water. He could already imagine how Karen would spin it later, probably claim Marcus had offered his pool for neighborly use, or that she was doing him a favor by making it lively. But Marcus didn't move. He sat in silence, letting his cameras roll, capturing every smirk, every splash, every stolen moment. Evidence. Irrefutable, undeniable evidence. The next day, the HOA struck again. Another letter appeared, this time accusing Marcus of disturbing the peace. Allegedly, neighbors had complained about noise from his pool. He stared at the letter in disbelief. He hadn't even been outside the entire weekend. But he knew who had Karen. It was so absurd, Marcus almost laughed. She was sneaking into his pool, making noise with her friends, and then pinning it on him through the HOA. It was beyond petty. It was war. But Marcus's patience was steel. He wouldn't let her bait him. Instead, he compiled every clip, saving them into neatly labeled folders. Day by day, the evidence grew. Karen in the pool on a Tuesday afternoon. Karen with friends on Saturday. Karen sipping wine on Wednesday evening. Each date and time stamped, crystal clear. Meanwhile, Marcus quietly made inquiries. He reviewed the HOA bylaws, scrutinized every clause about trespassing, property rights, and nuisance complaints. The rules were strict, but they worked both ways. If Karen wanted to weaponize the HOA, Marcus would turn that same weapon back on her, with truth on his side. Then, something happened that hardened his resolve beyond doubt. One evening, Marcus returned from a late meeting. He walked into his backyard, craving a quiet swim under the stars. But the moment he opened the gate, he froze. There, in his pool, was Karen herself, at night. The sight was surreal. Her pale float glowing faintly in the water, her drink balanced on the edge, her body draped lazily across the inflatable like a queen on her throne. When she saw him, she didn't flinch. She didn't apologize. She didn't even look embarrassed. She smirked. It was the smirk that lit something inside Marcus. That smug, unbothered smile that said, "I can do whatever I want and you can't stop me." She climbed out casually, wrapped a towel around herself, and walked past him as if he were the intruder. Without a word, she disappeared into the night. Marcus stood there, stunned. Dripping rage he refused to show. That smirk was burned into his mind. It was no longer about inconvenience. It was about principle. Karen thought she was untouchable. But that was about to change. From that night on, Marcus intensified his plan. He upgraded his camera system to store footage in the cloud, ensuring Karen couldn't claim tampering. He consulted discreetly with a lawyer friend who confirmed what he already knew. Property rights were on his side, and the HOA had no grounds to dismiss clear trespassing. Still, Marcus didn't rush. He knew the most satisfying revenge was not loud. It was precise, timed perfectly for maximum effect. And soon the opportunity arrived. The HOA announced its quarterly community meeting. These meetings were infamous. Neighbors gathered in the clubhouse, complaints were aired, and the board issued warnings or fines. Karen thrived at these meetings, often speaking loudly about neighborhood standards and pointing fingers at supposed offenders. Marcus had been silent in past sessions, enduring the side glances and subtle digs. But this time, he was preparing for a different role. In the days leading up to the meeting, Karen grew bolder. She brought more friends to his pool, stayed longer, and even left behind wrappers and empty bottles. Marcus didn't clean them. He photographed everything. He let the trash sit, knowing it was evidence. The morning of the meeting, Marcus reviewed his files. Dozens of clips, photos, timestamps. Each one painted the same story. Karen trespassing, Karen lounging, Karen treating his property as her own. It was airtight. That evening, the community clubhouse filled with chatter. Residents gathered, some eager to complain, others just there for the show. The HOA board sat at the front table, shuffling papers and adjusting microphones. Karen was there, of course, seated near the front, her expression smug as ever. She whispered to another board member, gesturing vaguely toward Marcus as he entered. He ignored it. The meeting began as usual, with petty grievances and minor updates. But then came the portion Karen lived for: community concerns. She rose dramatically, clearing her throat, and launched into a speech. Karen complained about noise from Marcus's property, about unapproved gatherings, about how some residents weren't respecting community standards. Her voice carried with performative outrage, her eyes occasionally flicking toward Marcus as if daring him to object. Marcus stayed silent. He let her talk, let her dig her hole deeper. When she finally sat down, satisfied with her little performance, the room was buzzing. The board murmured, some nodding along, and then Marcus stood. All eyes turned to him. It wasn't often he spoke at these meetings. His calm, measured voice contrasted with Karen's shrill tone. He began by acknowledging the HOA's rules, how he respected community standards. But then he shifted. He described how, for weeks, he had noticed intrusions on his property, how items had been left behind, how noise had indeed occurred, but not from him. He explained that he had remained patient, but the behavior had escalated beyond tolerance. Then he paused. The room leaned in. "I didn't want to bring this up without proof," Marcus said evenly. "Which is why I installed cameras." Gasps rippled. Karen stiffened. Marcus pulled out his tablet, connected it to the projector the board used for announcements, and tapped the screen. The footage played. There, larger than life on the wall, was Karen, walking into his yard, setting down her bag, stretching out on his chair, sliding into his pool. Clip after clip rolled, each one undeniable. The room erupted. Neighbors whispered furiously, some gasping, others shaking their heads. The board members exchanged wide-eyed looks. And Karen sat frozen, her smugness wiped clean, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply let the evidence play until there was no doubt left. "This," he concluded, "is what's been happening on my property, repeatedly, without permission. And every time a noise complaint was filed against me, this was the reality." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. The footage had spoken louder than anything she could twist. For the first time, the power she wielded so carelessly slipped from her grasp. And Marcus knew. The climax of her downfall was only just beginning. The footage froze on the projector screen, a crystal-clear image of Karen, dripping pool water across Marcus's deck, a wine cooler in her hand. The silence in the clubhouse was suffocating. Neighbors stared at her in disbelief, their whispers sharp and cutting. Karen's lips trembled as she tried to form words. This is taken out of context," she stammered, her voice thin. "I was inspecting. Yes, I was making sure the property was in compliance with HOA standards." A scoff rippled through the crowd. Nobody believed it. One of the board members, a stern older man named Mr. Halbrook, leaned forward. His voice carried the weight of authority. "Mrs. Whitman, you were inspecting his pool? With drinks and friends." Karen flushed crimson. Those were community guests. We were just on his private property," Halbrook cut in. His words fell like a gavel. Marcus stood silently at the front, his arms crossed. He didn't need to argue. The evidence was already dismantling her lies piece by piece. Another board member, a woman with glasses perched on her nose, shook her head. "This isn't just a violation. This is trespassing. You've repeatedly entered Mr. Lewis's property without consent, and you filed false complaints against him to cover it up." Gasps filled the room again. Karen's carefully cultivated image as the protector of community standards was unraveling in real time. She slammed her palms on the table, her voice rising shrill and desperate. "This is ridiculous. He's exaggerating. He's setting me up." She pointed a shaking finger at Marcus. "You don't belong here anyway. People like you." But she cut herself off too late. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Her words, laced with venom and prejudice, hung in the air like smoke. Neighbors who had once nodded politely at her now looked disgusted, shifting away as though her toxicity was contagious. Marcus remained composed, though inside he felt the sting of her words. Yet he refused to let her drag him down to her level. His calmness only amplified her unraveling. "Enough," Halbrook said firmly, slamming his pen against the table. "Mrs. Whitman, this behavior is unacceptable. The board will not tolerate harassment, false reporting, or unauthorized use of another resident's property." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She had thrived for years on intimidation, manipulation, and loud accusations. But now, with her lies exposed and her prejudices laid bare, she found herself cornered. A neighbor stood up from the back, his voice ringing clear. "I live across from Marcus. I've seen you, Karen. You strutted into his yard like it was yours. We all knew something was off, but none of us realized how far you'd gone." Another chimed in. "And she's reported me for parking too close to the curb. She's been abusing this HOA for years." The room turned against her. One by one, voices rose, neighbors recounting their own grievances, their own stories of her petty tyranny. For the first time, Karen wasn't the accuser. She was the accused. Her face twisted as she realized the tide had shifted. No longer in control, she grew frantic. "This is a witch hunt. He's manipulating all of you." She gestured wildly at Marcus. He's recording me without my permission. That's illegal." But Halbrook shook his head. "Not on his own property. And it's the only reason we know the truth." Karen's composure collapsed entirely. Her voice cracked as she shouted, her words spiraling into incoherence. She pounded the table, pleaded with the board, even threatened lawsuits. But the more she ranted, the clearer it became to everyone in the room. She wasn't a victim. She was the problem. Marcus finally spoke, his voice low but steady, cutting through her chaos like a blade. "I moved into this neighborhood because I wanted peace, a community where people respect each other. But for weeks I've been harassed, lied about, and disrespected in my own home. Not just by Karen sneaking into my pool, but by her trying to paint me as the problem." He turned to face the neighbors directly. "I didn't want this. I stayed silent, hoping it would stop. But silence only made it worse. So here's the truth, and here's the proof. Do with it what you will." His words carried weight, calm, measured, but undeniable. The neighbors, who had grown weary of Karen's reign of pettiness, nodded. The board conferred quietly. Their voices hushed. The tension in the room was electric. Karen wrung her hands, pacing, muttering under her breath. But it was too late. Finally, Halbrook looked up, his expression grim. "Mrs. Whitman, effective immediately, you are fined for multiple violations. You are barred from filing complaints without direct evidence. And should there be another instance of trespassing or harassment, we will involve law enforcement." The verdict landed like thunder. Karen's jaw dropped. She sputtered, protested, begged, but the decision was final. The board members ignored her pleas, their gazes fixed firmly on Marcus with something like respect. For the first time since moving in, Marcus felt the weight of injustice begin to lift. He hadn't just defended himself. He'd exposed the hypocrisy and cruelty that had poisoned the neighborhood for years. Karen, red-faced and trembling, gathered her things in a huff. She stormed out of the clubhouse, muttering curses under her breath. The door slammed behind her, the echo ringing like a final note to her downfall. The neighbors remained silent for a moment, then slowly turned toward Marcus. Some nodded approvingly. Others murmured apologies for not speaking up sooner. A few even clapped softly, their support genuine. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply nodded, collected his tablet, and walked out with quiet dignity. But inside, he knew this wasn't just a victory over Karen. It was a victory over every attempt to diminish him, every subtle or overt reminder that some people thought he didn't belong. Tonight he had turned the tables. Tonight Karen's smirk had finally disappeared. And for Marcus, that was all the justice he needed. The sound of the clubhouse door slamming still echoed in Marcus's ears as he stepped outside into the night air. The tension of the meeting hadn't yet left his body, but there was a deep sense of release, like a pressure valve finally opening after weeks of strain. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, he didn't feel like an outsider. He felt seen. The glow of porch lights flickered on as neighbors returned to their homes, still buzzing with conversation. Some offered Marcus a nod or a smile, gestures of solidarity. A few approached him directly, tentative but sincere. "I should have spoken up earlier," one man admitted, his tone heavy with guilt. "She's done this to everyone. We just let it slide." A woman added, "We thought it was easier to ignore her than to confront her. But you stood up to her. You showed us we don't have to keep quiet anymore." Marcus accepted their words without bitterness. He knew that silence wasn't always complicity. Sometimes it was fear, exhaustion, or simply not knowing how to fight back. But he also knew that one person's courage could spark something greater. Tonight, he had been that spark. The days after word of Karen's downfall spread quickly through the community. Where she had once wielded power through intimidation and endless HOA complaints, now her authority was shattered. The board's ruling was public knowledge and her neighbors no longer feared her. At first, Karen tried to carry on as though nothing had happened. She strutted around the neighborhood with her usual air of superiority, sunglasses shielding her eyes even on cloudy days. But the difference was immediate. People no longer greeted her with polite smiles. They avoided her, conversations cutting short when she approached. The power she had fed on, attention, fear, and control, was gone. Meanwhile, Marcus's life began to change. Neighbors who had once looked at him with suspicion now saw him differently. They waved when he drove by. They stopped to chat when he was in his yard. Some even invited him to barbecues and block parties, small gestures that marked a turning point. He hadn't sought popularity. He hadn't even sought revenge. All he wanted was peace. But in exposing Karen, he had not only defended himself, he had made the neighborhood safer for everyone. Karen's spiral for Karen, the consequences deepened. She had always been known as difficult. But after the board's ruling, her reputation crumbled entirely. No one trusted her. No one wanted to work with her. The power she once wielded in the HOA was stripped away. Her attempts to file new complaints were ignored unless backed by evidence, which she never had. Her gossip lost its sting because no one listened anymore. And slowly, the woman who once dominated the neighborhood became its outcast. The isolation ate at her. People whispered that she drank more heavily now, that she spent hours peeking through blinds at the neighbors who no longer feared her. Some said she was plotting, waiting for a chance to reclaim her power. But everyone knew that chance was gone. Marcus's quiet triumph. Marcus, life settled into a new rhythm. He no longer had to brace himself every time his phone buzzed, wondering if it was another false complaint. He could swim in his own pool without fear of who might trespass. One warm evening, he sat by the water with a glass of iced tea, the glow of string lights reflecting on the surface. He thought back to the first time he had caught Karen in his yard, the smugness in her voice, the entitlement in her posture. Back then, he had felt powerless, trapped between silence and escalation. But now, things were different. He had faced her, not with anger or violence, but with patience and truth. And truth had won. The ripple effect. The impact of Karen's downfall rippled through the community. The HOA board, once complacent, began taking complaints more seriously. They revised their rules to prevent abuse of power. Instead of allowing one person to dominate, they insisted on evidence and fairness. Neighbors, too, became bolder. When small disputes arose over fences, noise, or parking, they approached each other directly. Instead of weaponizing the HOA, people began to see the neighborhood not as a battlefield but as a shared space where respect mattered more than control. Marcus's stand had shifted the culture. It wasn't just about him and Karen anymore. It was about everyone. Karen's final embarrassment. One afternoon, months later, Karen attempted one last stunt. She tried to sneak into Marcus's yard again, convinced the cameras were gone. But this time, she was caught not by Marcus, but by another neighbor who filmed her on their phone. The video spread through the neighborhood group chat within minutes. Karen, dripping wet and furious, became the subject of ridicule. She was no longer feared. She was pitied, or worse, laughed at. That was her final downfall. After that day, Karen disappeared from community life. She stopped attending HOA meetings. She stopped patrolling the streets. She faded into the background, her once commanding presence reduced to a cautionary tale of arrogance and entitlement. Marcus's last word at the next annual HOA meeting. Marcus attended quietly, sitting in the back. He hadn't planned to speak, but when asked if he had anything to share, he stood up. "I didn't move here to fight with anyone," he said, his voice calm but steady. "I moved here for peace, for community, and I hope we've all learned something from what happened. Power without respect becomes abuse, but respect, real respect, makes us stronger as neighbors and as people." The room fell silent, then erupted into applause. Marcus sat down, his message delivered. He didn't need more. He didn't need revenge. He had already won the only victory that mattered, his dignity, intact and undeniable. The bigger picture. For Marcus, the incident with Karen was more than just a neighborhood squabble. It was a reminder of a greater truth, that prejudice, entitlement, and abuse of power still linger in unexpected places. But it also proved something else, that those things could be challenged, dismantled, and overcome. All it took was one person refusing to stay silent, and while Karen's downfall was satisfying, the real triumph lay in what came after, the stronger community, the better rules, the newfound respect. Marcus hadn't just defended himself, he had left a mark on the neighborhood that would last long after the cameras stopped recording. Closing reflection, as summer rolled into fall. Marcus often found himself sitting by his pool in the evenings, the water calm under the moonlight. Sometimes he thought about Karen, the woman who once thought she could control him, who had tried to reduce him to nothing more than a problem to eliminate. Now she was gone, and he was still here, not just surviving, but thriving. It was a quiet victory, but a powerful one. A victory that reminded him, and everyone else, that dignity couldn't be stolen, and truth couldn't be silenced. And in the end, that was the sweetest justice of all.